accordance with the theme of scaling impact in disruptive times, is about how we can support and accompany farmers in the sustained and long-term disruption of a changing climate. So I think we can all agree that we've long passed the time where scientific analysis has proven how and why climate is changing, and we now need to be laser focused on how best to support farmers to maintain their viable businesses in the face of shifting rainfall, extreme weather events, and disease and pest outbreaks. But we know that some of these CSA practices are expensive and quite new, and benefits take time to materialize. So we've brought together these 4 speakers who all are engaged in this topic at different levels and ways to give us some concrete experiences on the strategies, mechanisms, incentives to support farmers to farm better, smarter, and be able to adapt. So you can look at each speaker's bios, of course, on the WCF webpage. So I'm not going to read their bios, but we have a great group today. We have Winston Adams Asante, the Technical Advisor of Climate Change and Natural Resource Management at Solidaridad West Africa, global NGO. We have Dr. David Zilberman, a professor in the Agriculture and Resource Economics Department at Berkeley University. We have Ernest Wamena, the Ghana Country Manager for Sustainable Sourcing at Touton. And I believe we're supposed to have Abi Monet Innocent, although I don't know, Aaron, if he's been able to join. Abi is the Technical Advisor at EcoKim, Farmer Union in Cote d'Ivoire. Abby, I do not see you on the participant list, but please speak up if you're, when I call on you, if you are with us. So without further ado, I'd like to turn to you, Winston, first. Hopefully you'll be able to speak and we can hear you. As we think about the adoption of climate smart practices, can you talk about how Solidaridad works with farmers? How do you motivate farmers in West Africa to adopt change behaviors? Talk about some of the incentive support mechanisms that you're using.
Well, thank you very much, Stephanie. So touching on the issues, the fact that stakeholders in this meeting and elsewhere are talking about behavioral issues in adoption of climate smart cocoa demonstrates major gaps in how interventions have been implemented. There has been a lot of manuals, technologies, innovations developed for cocoa farmers to reduce vulnerability to climate stresses and improve productivity in the face of high temperature, and reduced rainfall. These innovations and technologies have been tested and rolled out by several organizations. Solidaridad, for instance, has implemented most of these technologies under World Bank sponsors dedicated grant mechanism project, the MasterCard program on youth in cocoa, and then the Netherlands Embassy project on cocoa intensification and rehabilitation. Out of all these implementations, we, for instance, know that one cocoa seedling to one plantain sucker is critical for cocoa seedling survival and ultimate establishment during rehabilitation and new planting. In the face of reduced rainfall and high temperature, the plantain suckers provide succulence and temperature to the young cocoa seedlings. Holding size, for instance, we have demonstrated on farm that creating bigger hole size of 1 foot squared holds a lot more water in the dry periods and is able to take seedlings through establishment. Looking at agroforestry as a major pathway to the implementation of climate smart cocoa and restoration of landscapes. There are also a lot of interventions around forest conversion to cocoa and what strategies and interventions to look at. What is particularly missing, which I would want to touch on in this presentation, is related to the enablers of these interventions. In the face of all these manuals that are all over on the internet, the technologies that are existing, and the fact that farmers are testing and using them, we are still not at scale with it. People are still using old behaviors. People are still vulnerable to the risk of climate in cocoa landscapes. And that is because the enablers around which all these technologies can be rolled out are mostly overlooked. And this affects the extent to which the interventions can be effectively and sustainably adapted and rolled up to scale. So mostly farmers touch on them, but because they cannot sustain it, they roll back. And we don't see that transformation we need in the landscape in terms of climate smart cocoa. Particular attention I would want to draw on relates to institutional strengthening and governance complexity to create framework within which climate smart practices can be adapted and scaled up. This particularly the case for tree ownership and on-farm tree tenant security. To date, in Ghana in particular, we still don't have consensus on what would be a good way to demonstrate ownership for planted and nurtured trees in cocoa farms. Forest encroachment for conversion for cocoa has been one major issue. What we are picking on the ground mostly relates to social drivers and law enforcement issues rather than productivity drivers, which has mostly been the argument. Critical also around migrants and natives are very topical issues that come up, and we have encountered them, the extent to which ownership of land dynamics around migrants and natives influence decision-making on what climate smart interventions to take, because most migrants feel they are short-term on the land and would not want to do ultimate investment that will cost them, if that is even climate smart. So going forward, what we have been doing extensively is around capacity building. Farmers, we realize, know the impacts of climate change on their livelihoods, but what mostly came up shockingly surprising was the fact that they don't understand the drivers associated with their land use practices, which contribute to some of the climate impacts that they are experiencing. So capacity building has been very huge and transformative in changing behavior in this landscape. The fact that farmers now able to understand the linkages between their land use practices and then the happenings on their farm has contributed greatly in, for instance, improving tree planting in farming systems, even without project support. People go out on their own to get tree seedlings and plant them on their farms just because they have gained added knowledge. The decision-making on climate smart practices also don't come the same way for males and females. So the gender dynamics has been critical. Surprisingly, the burden of adapting climate smart practices had different impacts relating to gender classes. The males were mostly more easy, able to adapt to these practices, tree planting technologies in holding, the labor burden that comes with it compared to females. So we have also gone the extra mile to always disaggregate the interventions along gender lines, and particular support have always been given to the gender class, mostly women and other vulnerable groups we have found to be unable to adapt specific practices and the cost burden associated with it. But the final part I would also want to touch on the capacity building issues is finance. Technologies around climate smart practices come with financial burden. And so mostly when projects and companies do the interventions in these landscapes, it's only touching those that they are directly working with. Upskill and adoption and transformation in behavior mostly requires impact around finance. So we have now turned around our access to finance and the village savings and loans approach into a mechanism where farmers can now tap into these resources and draw them to, for instance, offer labor services and pay for some other minor farm work and cost burdens that are associated with specific adoption of technologies in the farming systems. This has been quite minimal, but we have used it to open up ways for farmers to now access finance within banks and demonstrate that they are credit worthy and they are able to repay. So that is the extent to which we are demonstrating access to finance at that small scale level in the absence of major financial touch in these landscapes. But the final part also relates to cross-sectoral policy and intervention alignment to build synergy and leverage on climate smart action to drive behavioral change. The decision would have to be made whether trees on farm are needed for environmental and other agroforestry services, or for timber? It is a critical question that most producer countries have to answer, because we cannot keep supplying seedlings into the landscapes, and then the same tree seedlings that are to offer agroforestry services are now being used to, are now harvested as timber for export. This is then the disconnect between the interventions that are happening, and down it discourages a lot of farmers from engaging more actively with landscape restoration, agroforestry interventions in this landscape. On our part, this policy influencing component and strategies we have rolled out to help farmers safeguard trees in the face of these threats has been one of the strategies we have mostly used. And finally, the part on building synergies between interventions. Behavioral change would only come if we dedicate a lot of the attention we are giving to farmers as organizations together. We cannot implement one policy in 1 year, another policy comes or intervention comes in 2 years, and they are all disjointed in the landscape. Then we never achieve scale, and we are never able to transform these landscapes. It's about time now, from our experiences, we need to build some of these into a synergistic program and then roll them out within specific landscapes so that we can achieve traction and roll out effective implementation. Thank you very much, Stephanie.
Wonderful, Winston. Thank you. And I know the Solidaridad program has some very specific lessons. So please, folks, give your comments and your questions in the chat when we get to the discussion period. And Winston, we'll hear more from you. I think the points you brought up around capacity building, synergies, policies, all really relevant. I'd like to turn to you, Professor Zilberman. You've worked in, obviously, climate analysis and science for many years, have been advising in the cocoa sector. Can you give us your view, particularly on this question of what are the incentives and, as Winston said, the enablers for farmers to change behavior towards climate smart cocoa?
Thank you for this opportunity. The first thing that okay.
We can hear you well, David. Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so climate change is evolving. It's a dynamic phenomenon, and I really see that it's a real opportunity. And there are a lot of beneficial change that can be introduced in climate change. We can improve productivity and quality. We can introduce a lot of new varieties, and actually we have in nurseries a lot of new varieties, and we can address the issues of labor. But I think that there are several major obstacles. The first thing is that we need to understand the farming community better. There is a huge heterogeneity among farmers because of age, location, ability, credit, attitudes, and situation. And we all the time have to work with the people that are able to change, educate other people to change, and recognize that the sector will change. In the next 10 or 15 years, a lot of people will retire and new people will come, and we really need, when the new people join, to make sure that they will join in a way that will be environmentally and socially and economically effective. So adoption will be gradual, and we have to recognize it, that we need to be opportunistic along this line. The other thing is the issue of credit. I think that credit is a huge problem, and finding all the ways in the world companies developing some mechanism to provide credit, World Bank, because the return can be quite high, but if you don't have a source of credit, it will be a bigger problem. Another thing is all this element of a supply chain. We don't have a really good collaboration between public and private provider of equipment and technology. I think that to some extent, there are already emerging some private nurseries, but we need to find a way that there will be a division of labor between public extension, and farmers. I think that the organization like Solidaridad are doing a great job, but slowly we need to build the situation that there are private dealers that the farmers are trusting. And again, it relates to these issues of credit. So that you really need to develop a system that would allow people to do it. What we start to see is that we start to see in some areas cooperatives that are emerging, and in some areas that are nurseries, but there is not, but the system is really behind. And another thing is cooperation among farmers. I think building, I think that the companies and government should really have this, help people to develop this cooperation. So you can really develop a system that on one hand, you start having nurseries and retailers, you start having some organizations that provide both advice and knowledge, and you start having farmers cooperatives that can buy and sell together and have economic of scale, and we start understanding it. And then you have the issues of tenure of land ownership that affect a lot of the long-term commitment of farmers to their land and to adopt new practices. So this is, to me, this is a big challenge. Now, I really agree with Winston that having finance is really a crucial issue, and developing mechanisms that allow people to make investment and survive during that period is really important. Now, the last thing that I think is really important is to recognize that climate change is a dynamic phenomenon. It's evolving, and you need to develop a capacity to adapt all the time. And in some cases, some areas will have to give, to move from one, to switch from cocoa to other fields. And it's really important that if we lose the capacity, we increase yield and productivity in other areas, which is possible, rather than continue with the deforestation. So to some extent, we have to recognize that migration and moving to new area may be part of climate change, but we shouldn't really use it as a, we have to recognize that we have to increase productivity rather than have deforestation. And the other thing that is really important is to recognize that as people get older and go out of farming, you may have agglomeration and emergence of some bigger farm. Instead of fighting it, I think we can really use some of the bigger, more progressive farmers that enter the industry as a mechanism for change. So my feeling is that the cocoa sector is dynamic, climate change is an opportunity. There will be a lot of change, and we don't need to fight it, we have to accumulate it. We need to find a way to provide the credit, we need to find a way to provide insurance. And the key point is that the future will be different than the past. We don't need to think, gosh, how do we keep the status quo, but rather how to adapt it, and at the end come out as a stronger sector. And I feel that there are already signs that that's what will happen. Thank you.
This is great. I love this challenge to us to think about climate change as an opportunity. It's really a positive take on it, regardless of the scale of the challenge. I want to turn to you, Ernest, particularly this topic that Dr. Silberman said at the beginning, that we need to understand our farmers better. I know the Tutom program has done quite a bit to do that. Can you talk a little bit about how you're doing that and what that understanding allows you to do in terms of helping different kinds of farmers adopt these practices?
Thanks so much, Stephanie and Winston and Dr. Zimmerman. As part of, in answering this question, I want to present a work that we did 3 years ago, trying to understand farmers and deliver climate smart practices to them in a more targeted approach. And I'm really honored being part of Tuton to hear Minister Goldsmith mentioning us in the previous panel discussion. And in this work, we asked ourselves two main learning questions. To what extent can landscape and farmer level differentiation really help us design appropriate practices for farmers? And secondly, to what extent can coaching also really and help farmers adopt to climate smart practices? In doing this, we looked at the segmentation and the selection of the farmers, looking at it from a landscape perspective, and now narrowing down to the farmer level. At the landscape level, we looked at the climate change impacts, to what extent is the climate impacting the different landscape in which we source for. We also look at the production capacity of these landscapes, and also finally looked at the demographics. What is the land tenure systems or issues that happens in those landscapes? Then after doing those selections, we now move to the community level. Then at the community level, we want to see where we have a stronger footprint, and we can really be able to deliver good services to these farmers. Then from the community, we now moved to the farmer level. Then at the farmer level, we just did an initial DEX study, DEX research to select farmers who are hypo. The hypo farmers, at least the farmer should be able to get 500 kg per hectare. And this pool of farmers, we wanted to know which one of them will have a high propensity to adopt these climate smart practices. And to do that, we resorted to the Farmer First research that was done in Mali and Tanzania that tried to group farmers into 6 categories. And in these groups, we asked questions that relate to their attitude towards farming. And in there, we have, as you can see on the screen, the contented dependents. So as the name suggests, they are very positive towards farming, but they want to depend on somebody to move on. Then we have the optimists who love agriculture, they seek information to move on. We have the frustrated escapists, and those groups, they love farming, but when they get other opportunity, they just do farming. But if another opportunity comes, they will move on. The traditionalists is very conservative. We also see the trap. They are stuck in cocoa and they really don't see their feet around. So this is generally the different groups that we put them. But after doing the segmentation, we realized that you could not actually correlate this attitudinal segment to other structural indicators such as income, yield, and all that. But we said, no, we really need to move ahead. And how we move ahead is let's give a full package of the coaching services and the incentives for them to adopt those practices for all of them and see how adoption will pan out as we move on. Next slide. So just to run it through what we saw from the landscape, this is planting material. So you can see differently how planting material looks like at the landscape scale. You're looking at the southern, the middle portion, most of those trees are bad, meaning that the varieties they got weren't from a good source, and that no matter the interventions you do, you will not be able to get the desired results. And the same thing to the western north, go to the western side of the map. We see more of new good materials in going to the northern side. And those areas, when you look at it from a climatic point of view, it's also not very favorable climatically, but most of those farmers got the new varieties. So at least it's for knowing how the planting material dynamics looks at the landscape scale, you can be able to design and tailor-made your climate smart practices. Next slide. Yes. So this one is on the age of the plantation, and it relates very well also with the first slide, which talks about the planting material, and realize that most of the trees that are not good are very old. The new ones are pretty much younger, and that in designing your climate smart practices indicated by Weinstein and Professor Zipperman, you want to be able to target young ones who can be able to help with adoption and improve productivity. Next slide. The farm area, we selected farmers who are getting at least 500 kg per hectare. And already we are putting them in a pool where we know that these farmers are the high yielding farmers who are really willing to adopt. So we see that we have a lot of farmers who have quite a big number of farms. And also in certain areas, the farms are quite small. And looking at their level of income, you want to be careful as to what practices you recommend for them, because if the farm is quite small, then their propensity to adopt will also change. So we look at it from the landscape perspective. Next slide. Then pruning. Generally see how pruning looks across the landscape at baseline. Farmers wouldn't be willing to adopt pruning practices, but we see some level of adoption even in the area where we think that climate is really impacting. But how can we change the behavior of farmers towards pruning? If you can see this happening across Ghana, and this is not limited to this project, this is the general situation across Ghana. Well, farmers adopt, no matter how you give them the training, the coaching for climate smart practices, this is generally what we see. But the next slide will tell the extent to which adoption is happening. So this is looking at an interaction between climatic information, where we have more, so the blue areas look at rainfall, volumes we receive throughout the year, and the drier portions far up in the north. And we realized that in the very south, the western south, adoption was low a bit, and also in the western north bit, also quite low. In the western south, the very south, the implementation had only taken place for only 1 year, but that of the western north is for 3 years. And comparing that with the northern part, and also even to the central, where we expected more adoption, it didn't happen like that. So why are farmers not adopting after coaching them, providing them with all the incentives to adopt? Then we look at the different issues that come to play. First one is on demographics. In the western north area, we realize that most of those farmers are migrants. And during the beginning of the season, the landowners will come and talk to the commercial managers, take loans, or the money that they project can be harvested during the season and take it back into the cities. So they leave the migrant to work the farm to pay those loans. And in the process, the migrant will not even have the money to also maintain the farm. So most of the farms in those areas are managed by migrants. They don't take care of the farms, coupled with the fact that there's also disease, okay, CSSV disease that is coming up. So knowing this generally as the attitude and the socioeconomic issues affecting the farmers, then you want to really look at your climate smart practices. To what extent will farmers change? If these are some of the enabling conditions around their attitude. But as we move to the farmer level, let's see how the dynamics play. Next slide. So in this slide, it gives a unique analysis of the different categories. Out of the 6 categories, we have 3 of them here. And these 3, you will see those colored in yellow, those colored in blue, and also white. The yellow ones, these are active practices that farmers will do anyways. But those in blue and all that, if they don't do, in brown, if they don't get any support, they will not do that. And you can see on the screen, the white one, those ones, whether they get all the support, they wouldn't even want to do it at all. If you pick the competent optimist was willing to integrate improvement of soil physical condition through using compost and also weeding their farms very well. We see that also with the dependent. They also did very well when it comes to adopting these practices, but all the other groups wouldn't want to invest because they feel that somebody should support them. And studying the data, we realized that just after 3 years, you can actually relate the work that was done initially in Tanzania and Mali, and that segmentation to actually showed a good data and correlation after 3 years of implementation. Next slide. And the same thing that we see with the independent, the traditionalists, and the trap. You realize that the only thing that they are focusing on are the activities that relate to diseases, harvesting, plant health. That is all. For the rest of the activities, they wouldn't want to bother themselves with. They will want more investment from partners, government, or any other partner. One particular intervention that all the different groups wouldn't want to invest in was pruning. And with pruning, so what strategy can actually be put in place such that adoption of pruning can take place at landscape scale? We saw the government approach of doing a broad pruning exercise through the pruning gangs to be very efficient at this level. So those are some of the things that we have to look at in designing these climate smart practices. And in conclusion, in the last slide, asking ourselves the question, what variables really matter in selecting early adopters? Looking at these different categories we have, we realize that for the trapped and the contented dependents, as we discuss with them issues on income, you are more likely to influence them. For the frustrated, they look at more on the total farm area, the average size of their family, and they start complaining, and how can you influence all this through other means? Should we look at access to finance to really support this group? The optimists to look at, okay, are they higher yields? Are the farms really young that can really do the work? Those are the things they look at. Then the traditionalists are more influenced with the farm size, the average area, and the independents influenced by the labor cost, because particularly for them, they are not so much in tune, like they're not so much interested in the cocoa business, and that should anything come, they go along with it. So pretty much this is the experience that we gathered through the 3 years work to be able to deliver climate smart practices to farmers, looking at their behavior and how we can use that behavior to package it in such a way that adoption can increase. Thank you, Stephanie.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ernest. And I'm going to open it up to questions and discussion soon, but I just want to follow up on this approach of segmentation, which is quite interesting. The farmer first approach that you speak about, I know came from a very large study, really to look at farmers more as our clients and how do we better tailor services to different kinds of farmers. For you as a company, for Touton, how do you then take this information? Now you understand the variables to look at. How do you then tailor your services? Do you have a package that is really focused for the optimist kind of profile? Or are you still, because it's quite hard if you go into community to sort of find those people or sort of offer different packages of services to different groups?
Yes, so I mean, picking back from what we do most, what we do is that we do initial profiling. So once you fall into the good pool, you are giving us enough justification to prove that you are somebody who can adopt the practices, and we can give you the needed support and linkages, for example, to financial support systems. And on top of that, we also have complementary services that we provide through our rural service center network we have, where we provide all the different coaching support and where there is even need for financing. That is where we try to see we can pick the linkages with financial institutions.
Wonderful. So for Winston and David, just to come back to, both of you talked about the labor issue and the challenge that adopting some of these practices. I mean, we saw from Ernest's slides that the adoption of planted material varies quite a bit and is related to farm size and of course related to demographics and tree and land tenure. Winston, I wonder if you would comment on the ways that Solidaridad is addressing this issue of addressing the cost of labor, whether it's in pruning or renovation, or indeed input application.
Yes. So what we have done at Solidaridad is to begin to deal with the sustainability component of our implementation. We usually get financial support from donors to run projects, But once we want to sustain the interventions we have rolled out and we want to also upscale the interventions, then we are looking beyond donor support. Government support for some of these adoptions are also quite minimal. So what we do for now, whilst we are looking for broader access to finance around climate smart adoption, is to turn around the village savings and loans activities. Now, what does that is two-step. The first step is the fact that a group of farmers forming some small form of cooperatives are able to generate savings that they can lend at no interest to themselves to pursue specific services that come along with the cost, the cost of adapting climate smart practices, be it the buying of plantain sachets, because they know that they need to do that in order to let the seedlings survive, be it labor services for the holding, because they need external support in order to use those methods, because they are not allowed to use their children, child labor issues, and all those labor aspects. Now, given that this access to the savings is minimal, we try to also use this to overcome the fear, the risk that is normally associated with farmers in terms of loan repayment. Most of the financial institutions find it very difficult dealing with farmers because they think the risk burden for repayment is very high. Now, what we have done with the trainings and establishment is to demonstrate to these financial institutions that these groups are credit worthy and they're able to access finance from these financial institutions to deliver services on their farms. So these are the approaches we have been using to overcome financial limitations associated with the adoption of climate smart practices to change the behavior and the practices to scale.
Just to clarify the point there, the program first brings people in and helps them do VSLAs for community savings. And then through that, is that the way that you help to establish creditworthiness of lending from banks to farmers?
The savings behavior, because then they lend onto themselves and pay back into the system. So you have a profile of people who are quote and unquote clean, and they have been able, the records show how clean they have. They take, for instance, $20 and promise to pay in a month's time, and they really pay back in a month's time. So these are ways that we use to demonstrate to the financial institutions that individuals are actually credit worthy and they can be able to be supported through whatever lending arrangement they can have, and that they will pay back, which is the major risk financial institutions have with farmers in terms of loan repayment.
Absolutely. David, Dr. Silverman, do you want to comment on this question, particularly around the labor needs of climate adaptation and the strategies to get around that?
Yes, I think that a key point is to recognize that that it's a real challenge. On one hand, we have a real challenge on one hand to try to work within a community, and on the other hand to try to recognize that there are individual differences. Generally from history, what you know is that adoption is that not everyone adopts, and when you have adoption, you have change. And as I said before, there is an element of change. So while we develop cooperative and try to develop resources for cooperative, it's also very important to let individuals to distinguish themselves. If people are doing a little bit better, let them get a little bit more credit and let them grow. I think that you have to be realistic. This type of change will result in some sort of polarization. You can have a lot of farms that will be 20 or 10 or 20 actors, not several hundred, but some will go out. Will go out. So to some extent, there is a lot of time pressure, and you really need to make sure and to demonstrate that you have success. The number one cause of any effective process of diffusion that you see that other people are successful. So to me, you have to work with farmers and to make sure that the technologies are proving themselves, and then people will believe you and they make the effort to do it. At the same time, when it comes to financial institutions, developing some sort of community guarantee is very important. And sometimes it may be that the companies and especially the marketers could find a way how they can share some of the risk. But I think that this is the biggest trick is all the time combining private and public, and combining issues of equity and efficiency. But without demonstrating that things work in the field, nothing will happen. And I think that's what some of the problems that really prevented the change in the countries that I know.
This is a really key point, is the shared responsibility that the value chain has and the sector has. So what I'm hearing you say is both support those successful examples, making sure that farmers are brought to see them, or there's a way to really disseminate those, because that we tend to adopt practices from people we trust, and if we see it, then we believe it. That's human nature. But also this question of what can the supply chain do? Perhaps Ernest, turning to you, your data on pruning was really interesting, just the low levels of adoption. I mean, pruning is so fundamental for cocoa tree health and increasing productivity and adapting, whether it's to fungal diseases or whatever. What do you take away from that? How do you, as a company and a program, want to increase the adoption of pruning? And if you can talk a little bit about the specific things perhaps that David and Winston have talked about in terms of savings and credit. And then I'll just say, before I go to you, Ernest, we're quite a small group because we lost people in the change. So I'd like to invite any of you that also want to raise topics or questions to unmute yourselves or raise your hands. But Ernest, first to you.
Okay, great. So as you said, pruning at baseline was really bad, and even after the adoption, looking at performance wasn't up to expectation. What we have done in the past based on this data is to also discuss as part of our strategy with clients to make sure that it comes complementary. So in part of our program, we do pruning across board, where farmers who are within a particular area, we give them pruning as a complementary service on top of all the other services that they will get from the RSCs. And we also leverage what Ghana Cocoa Board is doing, where they have set up pruning gangs to prune all farms, blanket across board. So we now really collaborate with government to make sure that that service reach out to farmers within our program areas. Even on top of that, speaking to the farmers individually, when they see you actually touching their trees with 1 or 2 paws on it, they start reacting and want to fight with you. But I think it's the best way to go. If you want the farmers to do that, they have this feeling towards the trees, and they wouldn't want the trees to be touched. But if you have an external person doing it, aside the education giving them on the benefit of pruning, I think gradually we'll be able to change their behavior and attitude towards pruning. And secondly, if you have best management farms, which we have established now, and demonstrating how if we do structural pruning and rearrangement and all that, they can still end up in high yields, farmers will appreciate that. And now they've started seeing those benefits. And I do agree with Professor and Dr. Winston on all their comments as to how do we raise financing to support this. As private sector entities, we will not be able to shoulder all the costs of farming, though through the supply chain we provide some support with capacity building and setting complementary services through the premium and all that. We also expect farmers to be able to raise the needed financing, be make themselves good to be able to get financing from banks and all that. So the VSLA concept has really worked. We have also bought into the idea to make sure that farmers are able to handle that component at this level as much as possible. Thank you.
Yeah, Dr. Zibelman, go ahead.
I think the issue of pruning is very interesting, because I've been 10 years ago in Ivory Coast and we tried to sell pruning. It didn't work. I think the real reason is that you need a package of several things so it will be spectacular. Today, what happened with pruning, there were 2 or 3 farmers that did very well with pruning, but other farmers realized that it's too much work and they don't gain a lot. So a lot of time you think, gosh, how you can have something that will increase yield, let's say by $50 or $100 per hectare at least, so they will be worth the effort. I think trying to think packages that will make a big difference, and then when you have some success, other people imitate it. Having one component individually can a lot of time result in slow adoption.
Winston or Ernest, do you want to respond to that? Winston, you're muted.
Yeah, sorry. I think essentially the question of at what point would donor support come in, and at what point do we want to let farmers on their own sustain climate smart practices are very critical issues that would always have to be looked at. And if there are best practices which can help farmers do this, we have tried the VSLA approach. We have tried linking farmers to financial institutions. We have seen the bottlenecks in those engagements, and we are trying to overcome it. In the absence of that, what really happens is that the farmers depend on money lenders within the communities who sometimes use 100% interest rate at far shorter time than the financial institutions will give them. Mostly, they are unable to pay back. And what happens is that the money lenders take over the farms so that they can harvest the pods and pay back. They pay themselves back, and whatever is left, they give it to the farmer, and then they give back the farm to the farmer. These are not people who are farmers. They are just interested in the pods. So they don't do any best practices. They don't do anything. They only go in and harvest whatever pods they can get for how long it can give them. And that is a major issue around adoption of climate smart practices. So access to finance is critical. And for what we have done mostly is to depend on handouts, pockets of interventions. It is about time we need to focus these interventions within landscapes. Let organizations come together. Let us all work within one landscape, achieve the needed results, and scale up gradually into other landscapes, rather than spreading ourselves so thinly with different packages, and we are still where we are. We are never climate smart in these landscapes.
And do you see any of that trend happening in any landscapes that you're working in West Africa, in terms of, I mean, you also talked about the need for strong institutions and a sustained approach, so that there aren't these pockets of sort of insufficient support. Are there examples of that synergistic?
Yeah. There are examples of private sector sustainability programs and NGOs combination. NS was talking about government, private sector partnerships. But again, the gaps still remain. Are we having the package along with these partnerships to the extent that 10 years, 15 years, or 8 years, when we go back into the landscape, we are seeing real traction and skill? What I see mostly is that the partnerships are mostly not able to move effectively beyond the duration of the intervention because they are time bound, and then they roll back because the farmers are never able to sustain it. So you go, and today, 2-3 years, they are fine. The 4th year, 5th year onwards, they go back to the baseline situation, and we come to square one. So we are always talking about the same things in the landscape.
So I want to build on that. And for our quiet participants, you can come in at any point. I know a number of you are experts in your own right, so don't be shy. But I wanted to ask all three of you to talk about this challenge with climate change. Dr. Zilberman, you talked about it as an opportunity, that it could be looked at as an opportunity. The reality is cocoa can't be grown everywhere, or whatever crop it is. Some crops will phase out. And what is the role of different actors? So the private sector, Ernest, for companies like Tuton, how do you look at the northern band of cocoa production, for example, where heat is growing, rainfall is even more stressed? Do you pull away from those areas? How do you all at Solidaridad think about bringing in other crops into the system for those farmers that need to transition, Dr. Zilberman? So I'd love to hear all of you talk about that for particularly the very stressed regions of the cocoa belt.
All right, thanks so much, Stephanie. In the data I presented, you realize that going to the northern bound, we still had a lot of farmers that are quite new. This is the dynamics we are observing. We realize that in the western north region, which used to be the highest producing region for cocoa in Ghana, now dropped to the third position. Today has a lot of incidences of CSSV disease, and secondly, because they are migrant. Most of these farmers who used to be there are now moving away. And where are they moving to? They are now moving northward. So you see all of them settling in the borderline northwards. Now also more moving into Brona Hafo, Sunyani, and getting more northward. Though science and projections also say that it's getting drier, but we also observe that most of the seedlings that were made by available by governments and all that, farmers are establishing new farms also in the northern belt. We have interventions in these areas, and what the farmers are basically doing is that they understand very well that when you plant the normal 1,000 to 1,100 trees per hectare, not all of them will survive. So you will go to the farm and you will see more than 2,000 trees planted on a hectare. And you ask the farmer, why don't you follow the protocol, the correct planting distance? They tell you that definitely some will die, and as they die along within the next 4 or 5 years, he is going to thin out and be able to achieve their 1,000 to 1,100 trees per hectare. This is the dynamics, what they intend to do. But we also want to see how, if that's what the land available to them, they want to do it, what practices can you introduce? The shade trees, the different methods to help them. At least those farms are doing well. Then also connecting to the other supply chains. We know government is also promoting cashew even along those belts, and our NGO partners are they've started promoting those interventions. So you see most farmers trying to do both, one farmer with two commodities, and I think that can help alongside.
Okay, so I'm hearing from you the hopeful thing too, that you're not necessarily exiting as a country, as a company, you're not exiting those regions, but you're saying those farms can still be viable with good practices, with support. Winston, what's your view on that around those areas that are particularly stressed and may need to either transition out of cocoa or change dramatically?
Well, from the work we have done, we are looking at landscapes that are totally going to be kicked out of the planting zone because of the rainfall reduction and high temperatures. The environmental conditions under which cocoa can grow in those areas are increasingly becoming limited. For those landscapes, the farmers are already transitioning. So you are looking at the middle belts of the cocoa growing areas, the Chimankintampo area, for those who are familiar with Ghana, Winchi, those landscapes. Those are very high cocoa growing areas in the 80s, thereabouts. But because of the increasing temperature and rainfall reduction, they are already switching to short cropping system cereals, and they are ultimately shifting into cashew. So now when you go to most of these landscapes, they no more talk about cocoa. They are talking about cashew that is better able to withstand the microclimate that has been created in those areas. There are areas further down south into the cocoa belt that are now more or less moderately impacted. The situation now for those landscapes is not to abandon those landscapes. Those are the places that need to strongly be supported to adapt climate smart practices, adapt agroforestry, help them with water retention around holding so that seedling establishment can be quick and fast. In most of these landscapes, for communities that are not supported by some of these interventions that we have, they're only able to replant cocoa 3 to 4 times, something that is just 1 year. If you clear land and plant the cocoa now, by next season, it should be 1 year old growing very well. For most of the farmers who are unsupported, they do this 3 times, meaning they go for planting materials 3 times in 3 years before they are able to have some sort of success. Sometimes 70% die, 30% remain. They replant those that have died and keep replanting till they gain the full traction on the landscape. That's total waste of materials and resources. And these are the areas that need massive support through most of the things we have done. And this is also where my point on the enablers is very important. The cost burden that comes with these technologies has to be taken up. And we have experimented with some of these approaches. It is not the best. We need to still look in to understand how financial support can be targeted at farmers. And that is a whole discussion for probably some other platform. The third landscape is those landscapes that are still within the environmental limits. They are not impacted in any way. Rainfall largely remains, and that is the southern part, where Ernest was mentioning, is in that landscape, which is increasingly becoming the higher producing landscape compared to the previous data that we are already getting. And this is also because rainfall pattern and temperatures are quite well in these areas, most southern part of the forest zone. So these are the dynamics in these landscapes, and the emphasis is on the first 2 I mentioned. We have no option than to help these poor communities improve on their livelihood, because agriculture, they do best and transition into other cropping systems. Cocoa cannot keep them anymore. For those that they can still plant cocoa, we need to keep supporting them, and we have to be doing so unless we still want to have the first scenario play back again here in the second case.
Thank you, Winston. So Fausto Rodriguez from Ricoto has a question that's very related to this in the chat. And David, I think this would be wonderful if you could address this. Regarding this need for diversification, he's asking, in an agroforestry or a diversified system, cocoa with other crops or food crops, what, if any, is their role for the private companies? So you yourselves advise large chocolate companies. What is their role particularly in accompanying farmers to diversify or adopt an agroforestry system?
I'm really happy that we speak about things that 10 years ago we started mentioning. Some farmers will have to move away from cocoa. And on the other hand, we have new varieties and new capacity, as Vincent mentioned, that can increase yield of other farmers. And I think the companies basically have to be very, very focused on where they invest. They realize that at certain areas they can invest, and in other areas they can't invest. So I see, for example, that if you identify that at a certain area in the north you cannot grow cocoa very well, but you can grow something else, work with the private sector that you have a smooth transition. Instead of fighting it, basically try to build some partnership. Many years ago, I started saying, okay, you can double the yield and then you can grow a little bit of palm oil. You can increase the yield and then you can switch to other crop. I think that everyone will be better off if you don't have a situation that there is attrition of farmers that cannot make it in cocoa and don't switch. So to me, the companies have to work with private sector, World Bank and others to get loan to some sort of transition and identify area. Let's say that would be 60% of the area where you know that cocoa is sustainable and moves there. Now, if you have good variety, you can even increase productivity with groundwater and irrigation. So to some extent, the vision, if you go to 5 or 10 years in the future, and that's the dimension that we have to do, is allow transition, work with people that grow some other crop to take some of land that don't have a future in cocoa and really build a much stronger and productive cocoa sector, especially given that younger people will enter the industry. I think this is the vision that we started mentioning 10 years ago, and I'm really glad that people now speak about exit now. 5 years ago, no one could speak about it. So in this way, we made a lot of progress.
Okay, so I'm really hearing that the private sector needs to lean into that to sort of accompany farmers, and perhaps working with peer companies that are off-takers for other crops. Ernest, I want to turn to you on that. I know Touton works in diversification also, in addition to cocoa. There's an additional question here that came in around how do social norms influence the adoption of climate-smart cocoa practices? And you mentioned working with migrant communities that don't have perhaps land tenure. In this question of, do I invest more in my cocoa? Do I invest more in maybe food crops, short cycle crops? How do you see that in terms of the sort of social norms around diversification?
All right, so I want to respond to it based on another lesson we had in a particular landscape, more of also close to the western of area, where we introduced vegetables as additional source of income in addition to cocoa. As many farmers adopted the approach and the practices, because we were looking at it from one angle, that the crop, if the crop is a cash crop, and we can actually connect them to market, then the propensity for the farmers to stay in there and just after the first harvest, they continue the production will be high. So we worked hard to connect them to market, at least to the nearest city. And for 2 years in a row, we were able to onboard a lot of these migrant farmers. So they take care of other farms, but they also saw it as an opportunity for them to make money, and they connected to market. And interestingly, these farmers were getting up to $2,000 in 3-4 months, just growing cabbage and all that. So I see this diversification as very, very good if you can be able to help the farmers connect to the needed market. Though we do cocoa, there are also other companies that will be interested in other commodities. Is it possible for companies to start looking at doing multiple sourcing within the same landscape, so that the investment that we make to those same farmers doing the light crop using or using even other land use types that are not used for cocoa, they can actually invest there and get additional income coming on board.
And just a specific question, going back to what Fausto asked, how feasible was that for Touton to sustain as a company? I don't know if you're a vegetable trader as well as the cocoa and coffee vanilla trader, but just in terms of the company itself, is there a business also in it for you all to diversify? Or does it need partnerships? You have to have a program.
So particularly this one is mainly partnership. So getting to work with the relevant institutions. So for this project, we work with, there's a program in Ghana called Ghana Veg. So we were looking at how they can support vegetable supply chains. And with their support, we looked at how we can connect them to the needed markets. And those beneficiary farmers were able to stay in there. Looking beyond vegetables, there are other opportunities that could be looked at, for example, for Touton, but that has not been unlocked yet. But this can generally be also discussed, yes.
So, Fausto, you had one other question. Do you want to unmute and ask it yourself? Just want to give you that option if you'd like to.
Thank you for the opportunity, Stephanie. My question is mostly regarding to the use of the climate information. We have seen here in Latin America, there are a lot of the study about how climate change would affect cocoa plantation. So there is a lot of maps, lots of information, but how this information is translated in a strategy or action by smallholder farmers. So this is my same question for the context of Africa. How are the smallholders taking advantage of this information and making this into action, changing the place of the plantation, changing the system? How is that advancing in Africa? Thank you.
So Winston, this was how you started. There's lots of manuals, there's lots of tools we have, but it's really getting to the behavior change on the ground.
Precisely. And I have done a review of a lot of the manuals people have done on climate smart agriculture. You never come across the enablers. For instance, in one of the projects we started working on, not with Solidarity, but some other organization, trying to roll out climate smart agriculture through replanting, because we thought that was a good way to drive the landscape into a climate smart pathway. All the trees were old, unproductive, minimal shade tree incorporation. So all the wrong things for a sustained cocoa production was happening. And we needed to replant because they are over age anyway and they are not productive. Because when we started, we thought people would readily come over and just join, because this is a project. We are doing everything for you for free, including cutting and everything for free. And we are on your own land. All that we need is for you to give us your land. And then together with you, we train you to do the cutting, replanting, acquisition of planting materials, extension support, everything. The farmers were not coming. And they were not coming because some of them had issues with the perceptions of age. For instance, in some of the communities, most of the farm owners, and this is also one of the critical parts we always have to answer, who we are calling a farmer in the cocoa landscape, because there is the landowner or the cocoa landowner who makes the decision on the farm. There is the caretaker who helps with farm management. And then there are others who provide labor services. If you call cocoa farmers, they will all come because they work on cocoa farms. But real decision making lies with somebody. That was where we began to see the dynamics around people who are willing to do replanting. The older generation were telling us they are not willing to do it, very old, like 70 years plus. They are telling us that they are almost nearing their death. Why should they go cut their trees, and then how do they survive whilst you are waiting for the planted ones to start yielding? That should be about 3 years minimum. So if you don't solve that problem, they are never going to give you their land for you to rehabilitate. There are several examples around this, and that was why I was beginning my presentation with time to begin to look at the enablers. Let's take time to really see what really do these farmers need in terms of capacity building, in terms of social demographic issues. For instance, inheritance is a major concern. It is the only way people acquire land in these landscapes, family lands, community lands. I can only inherit my family land from my mother because we use the matrilineal system. We don't have money to buy land. Sometimes you are not even getting the land to buy. And that is where fragmentation comes in. So other part of the question also is, how long can we go the way we are going, and what are really the stumbling blocks behind productivity increases in the face of climate stress? And those questions, we have answered them severally. Point is, how do we now get financing to address the issues around the cost burden that productivity increases bring, that adoption of climate smart innovation and technologies bring? And have we prepared the farmers enough in terms of capacity building and created the framework well enough for them to implement and drive these climate smart practices? So these are my few thoughts on this.
Thank you, Winston. And we are at time. I just want to maybe just, first of all, thank you all for coming. And surviving the technical issues. Also, sincere thanks to Winston and Ernest. Dr. Silverman had to pop off to go teach. But, you know, I just want to say, I think what we're hearing here is this clear message from both of you that having organizations like yourselves on the ground that can have very specific community-based analytics so that you understand the farmers, you can couple this climate information with the enablers for adoption. It's a very strong and clear message, and really want to thank you both for sharing your expertise and thoughts today. I'll hand it back to you, Aaron.
Thank you, Stephanie, and thank you for your excellent moderation and facilitation of this somewhat technically complex, at least at the start, session. But I think we were able to have a very interesting and productive discussion here at the end. So I just want to apologize on behalf of WCF for the technical challenges that we faced. I also am sharing a slide here just to let you know what happens next. Please look at tomorrow's sessions, and the seats are limited, so please reserve your space in the available sessions. And then also feel free to connect with fellow participants through the Pathable app, where we're hosting this meeting, and then also, you know, use social media and other means to share your thoughts on the discussion we had today. So I want to thank you all for participating and joining this meeting.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Okay, goodbye.